Oops. One second, one more little glitch here. We'll be starting in just a second. All right, go. All right. Well, welcome to another edition of Public Leadership Institute's online webinars. These policy leadership sessions are really about to expose all attendees to policy solutions and ways to communicate and talk about our values and the change that we want to see in our communities, in our state, in our country, and beyond. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. My name is Dave Woodward. I will be your host for today's session. I'm the National Network Director with Public Leadership Institute. I'm also a local county official and a former state legislator, and will be helping facilitate today's conversation around a topic that is going to increasingly bag attention from progressive champions like all of you who are joining us around the country this afternoon. Just a little bit of background on PLI, the Public Leadership Institute's nonprofit, nonpartisan policy leadership center focused on really bringing attention to key issues around the issues of equity and justice, and working with public leaders to develop to work with those leaders to become more effective communicators and champion of those policy solutions that will improve the economic and social conditions for everyone. You can get a lot of information about us at publicleadershipinstitute.org. And we have a host of publications ranging from the Progressive Agenda, that's model policy that you can access through our website. All of these publications, if you're interested in hard copies, we can make those available to you as well. Communication tools like voicing our values, a special project on advancing abortion rights across the country, the playbook for abortion rights. All of those things are available on our website, as well as the host of additional information that will connect you to experts and expert content, if you will, around with our partners to be more effective champions in your community and in your public office, if you're affiliate, if you're an elected official or staff member for a public leader. So Public Leadership Institute, www.publicleadershipinstitute.org is a place where you can get a lot of this information. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I really turn it over to our guest today. We really want to maximize participation in all of these sessions and give you an opportunity to share, give thoughts, ask questions, give your own experience to make this as enriching an experience for everyone joining. We've got a number of ways for folks who can actually do that. On your control panel, you should see a little hand icon. At any time, you can raise your hand. We will stop plenty of times for questions. So if you are joining us from an ability where you can actually ask a question, you can put yourself in the queue, and then when we pause for questions, we will be happy to make to bring you forward and to ask your questions directly to the folks that are joining us today. I realize that people join us from a variety of ways. The most crazy one, that someone joined me from a cruise ship, and we're joining through their iPhone, and talking wasn't necessarily an option, but we do have an ability for people to type questions in the question bar. We will try to get to those as quickly and as frequent as people bring questions forth. So type questions in the question bar at any time. You can always email me at dwoodward at .org, and we will get the question to our host presenters and make sure that all your questions are addressed. So there's a variety of ways to get as much out of these sessions as possible. We really want to encourage you and really really want to make this as much a conversation as possible with the folks that are joining us today. So today's topic and why people I joined is how to communicate about science, the environment, and climate change. And particularly if we look at the national environment and we look at the people who are being charged of running the government that traditionally have been in charge with enshrining and protecting these things, and we are without question confronting a different reality and a different world, but there's plenty of opportunity for local leaders to weigh in. How do we effectively talk about these things? How do we effectively use our communication skills to advance our public policy is what we're here to talk about today. And without any further ado, I want to introduce you to our guest presenter, Erin Hurtis, who's a science communicator, which is an awesome title because I think it's and it's so appropriate in today's day and time to a concrete skill and tool and leader. And so, Erin, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Erin is like I mentioned, a science communicator based in Washington, D.C. He's worked on science, energy, climate, and public health policy. He previously worked with the Cater Communications, a bipartisan strategic communication firm, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, the country's leading science advocacy group. In 2016, he ran a field office in Ohio, in Athens, Ohio specifically, for Next Gen Climate, which mobilizes students to elect climate champions. And his website, and I'm sure he'll also help share that, is sciencecommunicationmedia.com. He is without question a resource that we all should be using. And thank you for being with us today, Erin. And I'm going to get ready to hand control over to you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping that as I go through my...
See it on your screen?
Great. Yeah, showing my screen
there
here.
You go.
All right, We'll fire it up. Hopefully everybody can see this. And I'll be pausing for questions and comments. And I would also say to everyone listening, for your stories and for examples you have from your work that maybe my presentation brings up for you that you can share with the group. I sort of subtitled this presentation, "The Stories We Need to Make the Facts Matter." Because very often on these policy issues that I work on, we want to lead with the facts. We know the facts are important. We want real facts, not alternative facts. It'd be very frustrating when the facts don't win. And I think the facts need some help. The facts need compelling stories. And I want to talk about that at length, cover some very tactical things we can do on these issues to make sure the facts are being heard clearly and to make sure that we're working with scientists and other academic experts, engineers, et cetera, you name it, so that their expertise is also heard clearly. My story in this field starts with this. This is the tokamak fusion test generator. And I got to go here when I was 12. My physics teacher uncle took me on a class trip, and it was pretty cool. This was my first time meeting real working scientists. I was a really big science nerd, I still am. But what was so amazing about this was I got to talk to researchers who are trying to perfect fusion energy. We're still trying to perfect it. If we ever do, it'll be amazing. But what was so striking was at the end of this tour, the person who took us around actually told all of us, when you go back home, please call your member of Congress and tell them what a great time you had here, because we're worried that we're going to lose our congressional funding. And it was really neat to have a wake-up call that early in my life at the age of 12 to realize that the science that I cared about so much and the politics that my family often talked about at the dinner table were actually connected. And I've gone on to do a lot of work with scientists to help them translate their research to inform public policy, to help policymakers understand what they know about our world. We run into a lot of traps that I think we can avoid, I think we can surmount to help explain to people why the science and the facts matter. So for instance, I went to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration a few years ago to give a talk. This is a federal agency. They are a lead federal agency when it comes to studying our atmosphere. and our ocean, and they're charged with a lot of important environmental monitoring. And I asked this audience of NOAA scientists, how do they describe their job when they're in that, sort of stereotypical cocktail party situation? So what do you do for a living? Well, I work at NOAA, right? What's NOAA? So one of them said, well, I tell people it's like NASA, but for the ocean, which I thought was kind of funny. I'm going to tell you about another science agency you probably know about. It's for the ocean. Someone else said, when I say NOAA, people immediately think of Noah's Ark. And I use that and I say, yeah, it is like Noah's Ark. I take care of seagulls and fish and all these other ocean creatures. And what was striking to me was that for a lot of the scientists that I talked to, they have their small slice of scientific research that they look at. And that's where they spend a lot of their time. And this happens on the issues we care about too. We really dig in deep. And it's sometimes hard to step back. We lose sight of that bigger picture. And I read them NOAA's mission statement. It's an agency that enriches life through science. It goes from the surface of the sun to the depths of the ocean. The agency keeps citizens informed of the changing environment around them. And it goes on here to talk about daily weather forecasts, severe storm warnings through the Weather Service, climate monitoring, fisheries management, etc. And what was interesting to me was that a lot of this communication was about what the agency does, on some general statements about why it's important. But I wondered, where was that connection to people's everyday lives? And I showed these scientists how institutions like Club Med advertise the ocean and advertise our proximity to the ocean and the atmosphere. And it was this thing, it wasn't like, where's the beef? It was, where's the fish, right? How do people connect to that agency's mission? Well, you want to be able to have like nice, clean, healthy fish when you go out to eat, when it's like sushi night for date night. If you had to make a Super Bowl ad to describe the valuable role that some of these agencies play, what would that ad look like? It'd probably start with this, not something like the mission statement. And we have to start with those concrete material benefits when we talk about the importance of science or the importance of the environment. Very often, we approach communication about these topics in a way that falls into what we call the terrarium problem, the terrarium trap. We talk about the environment as if it's something that's out there. And also very early in my career, I got to talk to an environmental justice advocate who really just put this in the best terms possible. She said, the environment isn't something that's out there. The environment is where we live, where we play, where we work, and where we worship. So when I do communication around these topics, I always try to start with that first and then work backward to why this is important and some of the bigger, broader issues that we care about. We also sometimes run into what I like to call a lanyard problem in this field, which is that if we're talking with scientists and experts and people who spend a lot of time at conferences talking to each other about the nuanced importance of what's going on in their field, we tend to lose sight of how to communicate to that broader audience that isn't at the conferences with us, that does not have a collection of lanyards in their office somewhere. And what I mean by this specifically is that when we think about our work, we often think about how we relate in position to other people who are also in our field, right? But we need to think about how we relate to external audiences instead. This is a tweet that went viral. It was from a healthcare professional talking about the difficulty of implementing Obamacare. And he said, and this is particularly in a rural clinical setting, and he said, if you need a team of economists, Vox, and 200 men wearing lanyards to explain how you're helping the poor, maybe you aren't. So that's a little rough, but I really want us to think about that because we tend to value complexity within our own communities when we're doing policy development, when we're doing science and environmental communication, and complexity can be such a killer when we're trying to communicate externally. We also sometimes suffer from a West Wing problem. And it's kind of funny to put it this way, because I'm a West Wing fan. I love the West Wing. But a West Wing problem is the belief that if we have the best speech or the most articulate argument, that we will win. But it's not always the most articulate argument that wins. Sometimes it's the simplest argument. And if it doesn't win, it's not the best argument. Right? And one of the things that I love about the West Wing is it's so idealized, but you have to keep this in mind. The West Wing was Clinton staffers and writers working on what they wish conversations had been like in the White House. They're often not like that. So we have to let go of some of these idealized versions of how we communicate and think very simply and very concretely about the benefits that are going to accrue from the policies that we want to see. So scientists, engineers, these other experts, where do you find them? How do you work with them? I'm sure a lot of you already have contacts in these fields. If you're in a situation where you need to tap into a new network of scientists, the first place I would start would be my old colleagues over at the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a 17,000 member science network. They're always looking for opportunities to connect scientists with advocates and with legislators and with folks at the local level and the state level. And federal level too, of course, where they need that scientific help. The other places that I would go would be scientific societies, institutions like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Meteorological Society, the American Geophysical Union are some of the major ones that I've worked with. And one of the reasons that I point people to the societies is that they've invested a lot of time and effort in helping scientists communicate more effectively about their work. And in the case of the AAAS Fellows, the American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellows, these are all scientists who have served in public agencies and in legislative offices. So they are people who have had feet planted in science world and in policymaking world. And they're often just some of the best leaders in their community and folks who are ready to do things like give public testimony, conduct media interviews, help write reports, etc. The sources that you all are probably a lot more familiar with in your own backyards, your local universities. And if you're ever doing, any federal work, I find this to be true in DC all the time. I'd much rather have a scientist from a state university come in to talk to a policymaker from that state than I would the most renowned expert in that field if they're not from that area. Right? You want that local expertise. You want those connections to local communities. So you have scientists who can help articulate why their science is important in a way that is framed very concretely and very locally. When I work with scientists and other experts, and I find this is true across a whole bunch of different fields, we need to be clear about when we're being accurate and when we're being precise, and what that means. Scientists always want to be accurate. And I think the sweet spot for public communication is on the lower left here. Very often when I'm working with scientists and when I'm working with other policy experts, because of that lanyard problem, because of that desire for nuance and how their peers will think about the communication, we make it a little bit more complex. We want everything to be highly accurate and highly precise. But we can tolerate a little bit of lower precision when we're talking publicly. And it's worth talking about that directly when you're working with scientists because you want to be able to translate it in a way that is heard accurately. And being transparent about that is really helpful for avoiding long back and forths over edits, miscommunications, etc. This is a quote from Dietram Scheufele. He's a social scientist who's done a lot of pioneering work in science communication. And he talks about this idea that, when we talk about these messages, especially on issues that are perceived as controversial, that there's no such thing as an unframed message, that people are always going to come into a conversation about scientific topics, about environmental topics, with some baggage. And that's okay. We want to be able to anticipate that. We want to be able to think about that. We want to be able to ask critical questions about how our message is going to be received. So here's an example on climate change of two ways that you might title a talk. And it could be the same talk, but think about how you're going to advertise it and how you're going to frame it. So here's the first title, Climate Change on Our Coasts, Managing New Hazards. Versus the second title, Coastal Hazards, Managing Our Shoreline in a Changing World. And this is pretty typical in climate communication. If I'm talking to an audience in the Bay Area in San Francisco, I'm absolutely going to be comfortable leading with climate change because that's an audience that's probably already very comfortable thinking and talking about climate change. If I'm hosting a meeting and I want to talk about sea level rise in New Hampshire, I probably shouldn't lead with climate change. Well, it depends, but it's going to be a more politically diverse audience. It's going to be an audience that might have some baggage around climate change. So it's fine for climate change to be the second or the third or the fourth thing that you bring up. And it's important to put these issues that we care about in context, again, of the things that people care about in the first place, right? We all care about our coastlines, our shorelines, we're from coastal communities, and we want to lead with that. Start from that perspective, work our way back. One of the other things that we absolutely need to do in environmental communication and science communication, a lot of these other issues, is make it clear that people have agency. These are migrating climate graphics. This is from a climate assessment in the US Northeast that we did several years ago at UCS. And what you see here is basically, what is the climate of a given state or geographic area going to look like under a lower emissions scenario in orange versus a higher emissions scenario in red. And these graphics, they became iconic in the field because they laid out, what are the consequences of continuing to rely heavily on coal and oil and continuing to have all this tropical deforestation that causes climate change versus this lower emissions clean energy future. And this is important because it shows people that climate change isn't inevitable. It shows them that we're not helpless in the face of climate change, that we face critical choices, that we're essentially on a moving train, right? That we have agency and choices to make. One of the other interesting things, again, to this point about accuracy and precision in doing that project was that when we developed the main messages for this climate assessment, after the scientists had done their work and we asked, how are we going to communicate this publicly? The communications team said, you know what? The thing that unites all of these findings, everything about its snowfall and how it's going to affect the crops and the precipitation and sea level rise, the very character of the Northeast is at stake because of climate change and because of global warming. And the scientists said, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't like that. And we asked them why. I said, well, there's no scientific definition of character. What does that mean? But again, back to that terrarium problem, character for people is about where we live, where we play, where we work, where we worship. So if you're in Maine and you talk to people, what is the character of Maine? What does it feel like to live in Maine? You can have a very specific conversation about climate change in Maine. If you go to Massachusetts, what does it feel like to live in Massachusetts? What's it like to be on the shore here? You can have a very specific conversation about that, and then you can have that broader conversation about climate change. And when we released the report, that wound up being the #1 message that the media picked up on, that policymakers picked up on, and it gave them that lens that they could look at that allowed them to understand the science accurately and why the science and the fact matters. That was the story we needed to tell about the science. Oops, sorry, did I mute there for a second? Okay, I'm back now. This is some research about stereotypes that people have about different professions in society. And down there you see competence. So these are questions about, how smart do you think a person in this profession is? How competitive do you think their profession is? How high performing do they have to be to succeed? And then over here on the left, this is an important one, warmth. Do you trust people in this profession? Do you think they have your best interest at heart? And what's interesting to me, this was not research that focused on science communication initially, but you wind up having all this interesting stuff over on the right here. If you look over on the circle on the right, the professions that are viewed as highly competent, but not that warm. You see lawyers who unfortunately have a bad reputation, CEOs, and then a little bit higher on the warmth scale, accountants, right? And then this cluster of folks that I work with a lot, researchers, scientists, engineers. Okay, now let's look at who's viewed as a little bit more warmly than that. Professor, doctor, nurse, teacher. And I often ask scientists, okay, you're a scientist or maybe you're an engineer, why aren't you perceived as warmly as a professor or a doctor or a nurse? And when we have these conversations, it becomes clear that, for most people, if they're just thinking generically about a scientist or an engineer, they don't really understand what that person does. It sounds fancy, but they don't know how it connects to their lives. They don't have a picture in their head of what that person actually does. Now, if it's a professor or a teacher, you've interacted with these people. You have a sense of what they do. If it's a doctor or a nurse, the public service that person provides through their work is so incredibly evident. So I often encourage scientists, engineers to say, okay, what's sort of the public healthy thing that you do? Back to that the fish dinner. What's the public service that your science ultimately provides? Even if you're down in the weeds somewhere else, where working on your piece of the big scientific puzzle, how does that connect to people's lives? And also, nurses, doctors, public health professionals, they are some of the best environmental communicators I have worked with in my life. And I often, think back to a lot of clean air campaigns over the years, and nurses just have so many stories. They have such a deep connection to the communities that they work in. If you are working on a campaign and you have an opportunity to work with some nurses, they're some of the best spokespeople in the scientific community that I could think of. So I would just throw that out there as sort of the ideal for us to think about when we have experts who have real connections to the local communities, and it could help explain why so many of these policies are important. Other types of spokespeople, this is Thad Allen, who is the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, and I would consider folks like this sort of unlikely allies in science communication. And I bring Thad Allen up in part because he's a really interesting climate communicator. He's somebody who has had to deal with sea level rise and melting in the Arctic when he's thinking about Coast Guard operations. So he's someone who can go in and talk to a national security audience, a more conservative audience that isn't used to thinking about environmental change. And I saw him do this in New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. He said, you know, it's not my job as the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard to go question climate science. It's my job to listen to what scientists have to say. And if they tell me the Arctic is going to melt, I'm going to listen to them. And for these military leaders, they're also very used to talking about and thinking about acting in the face of uncertainty. Now, one thing I would say about this audience, and I think this is true for a lot of business voices too, you know, if you're working with somebody who can appeal to a conservative audience in a way that a progressive advocate often can't, in a way that scientists sometimes can't, I think it's important for them to really own their lane. And you don't want to crowd them out too much. You want to be able to respect the fact that they're going to be able to reach an audience in a way that you might not be able to reach, or that a different advocate might not be able to reach. But again, I would point to these sort of unlikely science communicators as folks who could also help get that message across to different audiences. So with that, this is our first pause. And I guess, Dave, you can come back on here too. Thoughts, comments, questions, any stories you have that this brings up for you. Let's open it up.
And like we said at the beginning, thank you, Aaron. As we said at the beginning, if there are any questions that people have, any kind of thoughts and reaction to what's been presented, this is an opportunity to raise your hand, type questions in the question bar and really start this, to move this conversation. I think that there is a lot of really good context in how how to have this conversation. How to add credibility to this conversation, how to be effective in achieving what we want for our target audience, but also add to that. So,
and I would say if you if you have folks who are working at public agencies in your community, this is absolutely true at the federal level. It's happening a lot at the state level too. You know, the scientists who work at these agencies need public support also. You know, over the past couple of years, the degree to which I've seen their work get suppressed or politically interfered with, that's been really disturbing in our field. And I encourage scientists to seek out community groups and people in the public who they work with to help demonstrate to policymakers the value that they're providing to help us get past some of these partisan ideological conversations we often wind up having around these issues.
Great. So we got a couple questions coming through. I'll start with Emily, who just typed in the question. We're planning a local march for science to coordinate with the National March Earth Day, April 22nd activities. In reaching out to science educators, for example, we are sometimes hearing concerns that the science march will be too political. Is there a way to break over this barrier? So, Aaron, I guess, realizing we're in a very, sometimes toxic political environment, how do we get, these folks that have huge credibility, maybe not as much warmth as we want, but that potentially have more warmth, how do we engage to be part of this activism organizing that we definitely see happening around the country?
Yeah, and I'm so glad the Science March came up because I'm helping with media on that. It's an all-volunteer effort, and we've been thinking and talking about this quite a bit. So one of the things that's happened in the past couple of years is I've seen the number of scientists who want to get more engaged in policy conversations grow a lot. So we're never going to be at a point where 100% of the scientific community, or really any professional community, is going to be comfortable hitting the streets, giving a public talk, testifying before Congress, etc. And one thing that I would like advocates to understand in particular is that scientists culturally are not that comfortable engaging in policy conversations, but they've grown a lot more comfortable. And you're going to find more and more scientists who are ready to roll and want to do stuff like this. For the science march itself, the part of the march that's going to be in DC, DC is DC. We're always going to have our stuff going on here. We're always going to have our baggage of national politics around the nation's capital. But when you're thinking about local marches in these cities, that is such an amazing opportunity for these scientists and these scientific institutions to demonstrate the value that they provide to their community. And one of the things about the march is that it's really more than a march. It's a teach-in. It's going to be a whole bunch of engagement opportunities in those communities and here in DC too. So I think it's an opportunity for these scientists and these institutions to make of it what they will based on what works in their community. And I think that's what's most exciting to me about it, is seeing these broad messages about the importance of science in public life and in public policy getting customized and localized to all those areas. So I'd love to know more. Please follow up with me after this. I'd love to know more about where you're planning a march and what city you're in, and I'd love to know who you're connecting with.
Great. We have another question from Hank, and I think this actually sums up. It's definitely something that kind of my initial thoughts. That I mean, in this opening section of the session, and Hank poses the statement and the following question: that science is excellent in describing a situation or a problem, but it seems to have been I have the word same, but it's been less effective in suggesting worthy solutions. Frequently, people use scientific evidence about a situation to support an inappropriate or wasteful solution. How do we use science to develop those appropriate solutions? And so definitely there's like this co-opting of science, this rejection of science. This is the environment that we're in right now. What are some of your initial thoughts? I know you're going to talk about more about this for the rest of your session. Maybe tease out some a response to Hank's inquiry there.
Yeah, I think Hank is right on. And when we talk about science, we need to understand that science can help us describe what we know. It can help identify a problem. Science doesn't always suggest what we should do in response. And very often, it's helpful to think about science that doesn't seem controversial at all, and then sort of imagine that it's applying to another scientific field. So just as a for instance, there's a guy named Mark Boslow who works at Sandia National Labs, and he's a physicist by training. Mark works on detecting near-Earth objects, the scientific jargon for asteroids that might hit the planet. So he and his colleagues, they're often talking about the need for a robust funding network to make sure that, we're able to detect these near-Earth objects, make sure they're not on a collision course with Earth, all that good stuff. And for him and his colleagues, no one is ever saying, well, we couldn't possibly do anything about that. It's too complicated or it's too expensive. It's just so obvious to everyone that this is something that we need to do. That's a hazard that we need to respond to and watch out for. So that's a very different conversation than saying we need to solve this environmental problem just because the causes are different, right? If the environmental problem is caused by a local factory, well, now suddenly it is actually a political debate about the environmental damage and the economic costs of addressing it. And very similarly, there's controversies in public health, and how much onus is on, say, pharmaceutical companies to prove that their drugs are safe, and the science can get caught up in those debates too. So I think with all of this, we really need to be clear about the job that science does, and we need to be clear about the values that we're bringing to the conversation that inform how we think about the problem and how we think about the solutions. And that's something that I encourage scientists to do too, because you got a lot of scientists who are comfortable sharing their opinion about what we should do, and for those scientists also, I try to work with them a lot and saying, okay, let's talk about where your scientist hat is and where your citizen's hat is, right, and which one you're wearing, and being clear about that, because people will try to. Everybody wants science on their side in these debates, right? So we have to be clear about where science and values differ and where they intersect.
Great, well said. And Bill poses a question that actually just added another question to it, so I'm going to try to combine them. we spend a lot of time, particularly in these sessions, about how to effectively message to a persuadable audience. So these are generally those who don't have your independence, people who fundamentally are persuadable based on the argument. And it poses a statement and a question is like how one frames a message. If you're going to frame it in in the scientific context, really depends on your audience. And so using that kind of this persuadable audience, to what degree does it change the stories that you'll use to, build a case? And I think just your last explanation to the previous question starts, that citizen and scientist hat and how we effectively balance that starts to answer that. But I don't know if you have anything further to answer. If you're, there'll be people who will reject you no matter what because they're convinced that their solution or their position or their belief is right, regardless of all the facts, information, science that will challenge that. But if we're talking to a persuadable audience, to what degree has your experience working with the scientific community and scientific experts to draw those stories that will be the most effective, if you can speak to that?
Yeah, I think persuadable to me, often when I hear persuadable or think about persuadable audiences now, I tend to think that it's an audience that usually hasn't thought about the issue all that much, and that's why they're persuadable. They're not ground in somewhere on the issue one way or the other. So I think starting from this perspective of, what's the end result is, hey, it's the fish on the plate, right? It's the clean shoreline. It's the stuff that's universal, right? It's preventing coastal hazards, something that's kind of obvious that we all do. Then go back from there and then start digging in on the science or talking to me about, recent environmental damage, something like that. I think for tougher conversations, I think when you have an audience that is actually resistant to, having a debate about environmental change and does feel dug in, that's when I think you need to approach it from a different perspective. And it's very often not going to be scientists who are going to be the spokespeople for that. It's going to be, consumer groups talking about why energy efficiency saves money. It's going to be national security voices talking about why we need to reduce our oil dependence. And that's okay. And bringing in those voices and thinking about how the message and the messenger are going to be perceived as credible by an audience that is maybe harder to persuade. It's something we got to do if we're going to win some of these fights. And at the same time, I also think it's just respectful of the fact that not everybody is, rah-rah pro-science, listen to the scientists. That's kind of a cultural thing that we have to think about too, and is often some baggage we bring into debates. Cool.
Great. Well, we have a few more questions coming in, but why don't we move to the next session, and we can always bring some of these questions back in. I want to make sure that we get through all the content that we're sharing today.
Sure. Yeah, so this is more on the solution side of things, and this is what I've spent, I'd say, the past few years of my career a little bit more focused on. Just the climate science itself has been this incredible story of clean energy deployment across the United States. This is the number of people who are employed by the solar industry right now nationwide. There's a solar census report that just came out this past week. And the growth has been huge. It's been really heartening. And what's crazy to me when I look at these numbers and when I think about these numbers is that the solar industry is still less than 1% of all the electricity in the United States. So as that solar industry keeps growing, it could be such a huge force for employment and job growth and job creation and income generation, reducing people's electricity bills over time. It's really exciting. It's also disruptive, right? Because it's so rapid. A lot of you have been involved in debates with local utilities about rooftop solar. So this is a space to watch, and it's been so interesting for me to see how easy the conversation about we need to do clean energy has become in some areas, just as the basics have changed, as the prices have fallen, as companies are employing more people, as policymakers say, okay, I'm not going to debate you about the science. We have this incredible economic opportunity and we're going to pursue it. It's also changing people's relationship to the power system. I hope some of you have run into Grid Alternatives, a really neat organization that helps build solar projects, and they're super community focused. and they support a lot of community solar. So people banding together to buy subscriptions to a solar farm, and especially in urban areas, whereas you can't conceivably have giant solar farms in the middle of the city. You can have folks who live, in an apartment building together and public housing together, buy these subscriptions to solar services, and they each have a piece of the solar farm. And this is just so fundamentally different than the relationship that we're used to having between people and their utilities. So some of these different ways of talking about clean energy have been total conversation changers. And again, back to that point about sequencing, having that initial conversation about energy and the opportunities that we have here, climate becomes like the third or fourth thing you talk about, and clean air and environmental problems generally, because the immediate economic opportunity is just right there, and we get to feel good about it because it also helps with these environmental problems. One of the things that I've worked on for a long time is clean transportation policy with regards to fuel economy. This is adjusted fuel economy over time, and I love this graphic because it shows this baseline of fuel economy from 1975, how much we've improved since the gas guzzlers of yore and the really gas guzzling vehicles out there just aren't on the road anymore. But at the same time, vehicles have still become more powerful. And they still weigh more. They've gotten bigger, even as fuel economy has improved. That's sort of the magic of technology development over time. We get to have our cake and eat it too, as all these engines and transmissions and all this automotive technology becomes more efficient. And very often, when we have these discussions, we focus on the cars. So a lot of the debate around fuel efficiency is, okay, well, how's it going to affect the auto industry specifically? How's it going to affect the auto dealers and the auto sales? Very often, we neglect that consumer angle. And one of my favorite colleagues, his name is David Friedman. He's an auto engineer by training. He's gone on to federal service, but he was participating in a debate with someone from a think tank that is funded by the fossil fuel industry and was against these fuel economy standards. And they're having this debate, and it was they were just kind of going through all the talking points that everybody's had about fuel economy since the 70s or 80s. And David finally said, you know what? It's not about all this. It's about whether or not you want to spend your money at the gas station, or do you want to spend your money going out to a nice dinner with your family or buying a gift for your spouse? That's the trade-off that we're talking about. And I love that because that was just an example of somebody who could take apart a car and rebuild it, maybe blindfolded, letting that go for a second and relating this what was a pretty can be a nerdy and nuanced policy debate. And keeping it grounded back in how it affects everyday people. It's super important. One other thing that I think we really need to get right, this was right outside the field office that I worked in Ohio, and I love this mural. This is in Athens, Ohio, which is in Appalachia. And down in the lower left there, this coal miners mural says, "Without labor, nothing prospers." And as we look at how the energy economy is changing, coal workers are hurting right now. Coal country is hurting right now. And the economic opportunities in clean energy have not been evenly spread across the country. A lot of it's been in California, right? So if you look at those national job figures, they're really heartening. Are those jobs going to Appalachia where other people are losing work? No. And I think we need to do a much better job making sure that all this economic growth is distributed fairly in the country, and that people in communities that are losing out can become communities that win. And these are very, very hard conversations because people do have this sense of loss, this sense that their culture and, again, the character of the place that they live in has changed and is hurt. And this is my buddy, Jeremy Richardson. And Jeremy is really talented communicator, and he's a scientist by training. And he is fascinated by clean energy, he's fascinated by climate, and he's from West Virginia. He's from coal country. His brother's a coal miner, his dad was a coal mine manager, and his grandfather owned a small coal mine. So Jeremy wanted to put together an event in West Virginia to talk about what the state's economic future could look like. And because the state's been through so much economic pain over the years, the way that he framed the debate, not the debate, the forum, it was a forum that we had, the way that he framed the forum was, what will West Virginia's economic future look like in 30 years? If we think 30 years in the future and work back from there, what does it look like? It's one of the best events that I've gone to. This was an event that Union of Concerned Scientists helped sponsor, so it's great to see a national organization go in to do something in Appalachia to help have this conversation. And what was so interesting about it to me was that it allowed people to drop their defenses around the debate of the day and come together around something more universal and more productive. So I think if you're in an area where these conversations are very hard, it's an opportunity to let go of some of the preconceptions that you have if you want to get people around the table to have a more productive conversation. And I think we also need to give people excuses for engaging with us. And it sounds weird to say that because we often think of excuses as in this first definition here. It's what's your excuse? It's an attempt to lessen the blame that we attach to something. What's your excuse for not caring about this or not wanting to engage with me in this debate? But an excuse is also something that we can think it's releasing someone from a duty or requirement, right? It's something that they feel that they have to fight for, and we're saying, you know what, we don't have to have a fight about this. We can talk about it in a different way. So for Jeremy to be able to bring together a conversation about what the state's economic future was going to look like in 30 years, that gave everybody an excuse to drop their defenses and come around and have a different conversation. Similarly, if you're having a dispute, over climate change in the state, and that feels like really hopeless, can you give people an excuse to have a conversation about something else, right? To maybe have a conversation about insurance reform, to maybe have a conversation about coastal hazards generally, to maybe have a conversation about wetlands preservation instead. There might be different conversations you have that can get you to that same place if you let people drop their defenses. This is Reverend Yearwood, who runs the Hip Hop Caucus. He said something along some similar lines that I also like. It's a little bit more of a proactive metaphor. And he talked about trying to make this concert happen. He wanted a big hip hop concert around the Paris Climate Agreement. And he was talking with a hip hop artist, a celebrity, and somebody who's been really successful in this space. And he'd been talking to this celebrity about climate and the environment for a while. And finally, he had like this breakthrough moment, and this musician said back to him, I finally get it, Rev. I finally get it. No matter how rich or successful I am, I can't protect my daughter from dirty air. We all have to breathe the air. I can't protect her from dirty air. And that was a really great breakthrough moment for him. And his message for folks who work on clean energy and in the environmental movement is that to broaden your movement, to broaden the amount of people who can come into your conversation and go where you want to go, they are not going to walk through your door. They've got to walk through their door. Right? I love that. They're not going to walk through your door. You can't make people walk through your door. They got to walk through their door. And I use this metaphor of like a stadium, right? But if they walk through their door, that's okay, because now we're all in the same place together. And as somebody who's coming from the hip hop community who's engaged with climate, I love that message, because he's bringing people in through this other door. And we've all got to welcome that to make these policy conversations, these political conversations more productive. All right. So I put in another break here for more comments. Sure.
Okay, perfect. And next, I'm going to call on Bernie Horn. It's people who join us regularly. He's no stranger, and leads a number of our other sessions around. A communication expert and senior advisor at Public Leadership Institute. Bernie, I know you get a.
Yes, actually, in the first section, Aaron, that map that showed different states moving south, that was quite a remarkable map. Was that saying that, like, if climate change continues, the climate in New York is going to be like the climate is in South Carolina? Is that what it was saying?
Yeah, essentially, and of course, that begs the question of, okay, well, who's going to help all the farmers, change their crops over, right? But yeah, that made it really concrete, and that grounded the message in a sense of place for people. And what's funny was people's reactions to it were kind of parochial. Like if you tell someone from Boston that that Massachusetts has become a little bit more like the South, they're going to be like, what? Because it really gets to how much your identity and how much your culture is tied to your sense of place, and it helps underscore what the stakes are. And I should also tell the audience that I actually used to work for Bernie several years ago. One of my first jobs in DC was with Bernie, and he helped me cut my teeth on thinking about policy and communication.
Um, Let me ask this. So the Union of Concerned Scientists has 17,000 scientists. What can you go to them about? I mean, what issues are they covering? If you've got a, if you've got a local environmental issue and you need expertise, what could you ask for?
Yeah, I think just laying out the type of problem that you have and what you're trying to work on, and the degree to which you think you might need some help from scientists and other experts, they're there for it, and that's part of the model. Is if you're approaching the organization and asking to connect with scientists in that community, the organization's job is to essentially help those scientists be more effective partners for community groups, for advocacy groups, for legislators, in helping basically shed light on the problems that they're studying. And one thing that I'm often struck by is that the geographic distribution of scientific expertise in the United States is remarkably uneven. And we unfortunately, we tend to concentrate our scientific expertise on the coasts, right? It's around a lot of these major research universities. And one of the things that UCS has done, which is great, is has gone out of their way to identify more scientists who aren't at Stanford or MIT or some of these other big research institutions, but to look more down at the local level and at the state level and say, okay, who's doing this work in Ohio, who's doing this work in Illinois, around their Midwest offices, because very often, especially in environmental and science communication, you often wind up hearing a lot from scientists who are at these major coastal institutions, and a lot less from scientists who are working with, say, ag extension offices in rural areas. And UCS has done a really good job, mapping that network and helping connect people.
I think of Union of Concerned Scientists mostly around, energy, nuclear energy, and nuclear war. What about health? Could could they even help on like abortion or I don't know.
Yeah, I think for public health issues generally, the organization has really helped out with that. And for any sort of choice issues, the main concern the organization's had there is around the fair application of science at, say, an agency like the Food and Drug Administration that will, look at approval for things like the morning after pill, and making sure that those decisions can be made free of political interference, which unfortunately has happened under multiple administrations, Democrats and Republicans.
That's great.
Yeah. And Dave, were there other questions or comments? Should I go ahead into the final section here? I think I'll take that as a yes. Are you muted, Dave?
That
Okay.
must be.
All right,
Yeah,
all
I
right.
can.
I will bravely plow ahead, and if there's more comments or questions, there'll be more time for this at the end too, for sure. All right. Um, this section is on misinformation, and I hope this applies broadly, and in my experience it does, in thinking beyond science. Sometimes I hear people say, I believe in science. And this is actually something that Secretary Clinton said during her acceptance speech. And that often strikes scientists as a very funny way to talk about science. They might believe that science is a really good way of knowing about the world, but they are thinking much more in terms of facts and evidence and data. But I think it's interesting that people outside the scientific community often say that, and I actually latched onto this idea of like, I believe in science, because again, we always want science on our side in these debates. For researchers, there's this thing in our space, I'm sure folks have heard this term, but this idea that there's like a war on science out there, that people are going after science as an institution And I think that's true to some degree. As you can see here, for scientists, if you work on climate change, you're definitely feeling, that there's a lot of political attacks in your research. It's happened on evolution. It's happened on random stuff like conspiracy theories about the moon landing. It's happened on vaccines. It's happened to a lot of biotech scientists who work on GMO foods. They feel like they're under threat. And in each case, a lot of the times the people who are criticizing scientists or going after science in a given field, it's because they care about something in that given field, right? It might be the fossil fuel industry on climate change. It might be people who are worried about the safety of eating genetically modified foods, and folks who are, want organic foods and want to get away from agribusiness. So there's all these debates around the science that often gets the scientists caught up in it, right? So that's one way to think about it. I also think there's something more fundamental going on in our political culture right now, which is the whole alternative facts debate, the whole war on reality, whatever. And this is from 2013. This was one of Rush Limbaugh's radio shows. He devoted an entire radio show to what he called the universe of lies. I'll spare you my Limbaugh impression, I think. But in his telling, the universe of lies has 4 corners of deceit, and the 4 corners include science, government, academia, and the media. And I think some of the anti-science can be explained by more of this mentality, which is just anybody who claims to have ownership of the truth, and I don't like it, I'm going to go after them. I'm going to go after the elites. I'm going to go after just really anybody who can challenge my authority. And this is actually a very authoritarian way of going after science, of going after public employees, going after journalists, going after university professors. So I've encouraged a lot of people who work in these different spaces to see their struggle and this war on facts, this war on reality, this war on science, whatever you want to call it, it's actually related, right? People are getting a lot of alternative information online, and that's pumping directly through the policymakers. My most depressing factoid in communication right now is that Alex Jones, the InfoWar conspiracy theory guy, has about twice as many YouTube subscribers as NASA. Right? And NASA does a great job communicating. They have space footage, and there's enough people out there who, would rather tune into Alex Jones. It's a really challenging information environment, more so than it's ever been in my career. It is really troubling. So what can we do to fight back when we're getting hit with misinformation? This is from the Debunking Handbook, which is written by a bunch of scientists, a bunch of social scientists who run this great website called skepticalscience.com. And skeptical science is all about real scientific skepticism and debunking myths about climate change. And I love this graphic. Up top is the typical way we try to debunk myths. We start with the myth, and then we hammer people with facts. But because we started with the myth, we emphasized it a bit, and it creates a backfire effect, which a lot of you probably heard about. So this alternative method, which they've developed, which they've deployed, which they've tested, is to start with the facts. When you're confronted with a myth, don't immediately respond and take the bait. Start with the facts. Explain why the myth is wrong. Back it up with more facts. And then people are going to be left with the facts because you put the appropriate amount of emphasis on them. So, you look at media coverage of these ridiculous voter fraud conspiracy theories, and these headlines rankle me. After his claim of voter fraud, Trump vows major investigation. Where you see stuff, Trump makes his crazy claim about voter fraud, without evidence. Come on, right? These are just conspiracy theories. They're lies. Really terrible news. So I hope the media gets better at this over time. I think in the meantime, we all need to get better at it. This is another example. This is the 5 Myths feature from the Washington Post. And this was an article that Olivia Nuzzi did for them, and it was myths about the alt-right. And this is how they format this feature in the Washington Post. It's a very prominent, popular feature. Myth number 2, the alt-right is a bunch of juvenile pranksters, all in boldface. And then it's followed by people who repeat that myth, and then finally it's followed by the debunking. So when you present a debunking this way, you've spent 2/3, 3/4 of your audience's attention on the myth. So it might be debunked in the moment, but I guarantee you a big portion of the audience is going to come away from a myth debunking like this in a couple days. If you ask them what's true, what's not, is the alt-right really just a bunch of juvenile pranksters? They'll say, oh yeah, I think that was the case. I remember that. And I get worked up about this because I feel like it'd be so easy to just do this a different way. And in fact, it is. And I think we can do this a different way in our own communication. Oh, I'm sorry, this is kind of fuzzy. This is a bologna sandwich. And this is how I translate what the skeptical science folks have talked about. And that's to have a big piece of bread full of facts, and then you have your sad little piece of myth bologna, and then you have another big old piece of fact-based bread, right? And the bread can be wheat, it can be white, it can be organic, it can be gluten-free, it can be whatever you want. The bologna should be sad. The bologna should be that sad little single slice of bologna, right? And you don't want to spend too much time emphasizing the myth. So just as an example on climate change, very often a first reaction question or whatever you might get from somebody is, it's just the sun, right? And a scientist would be tempted to answer that and say, well, we know it's not the sun because we have these satellites and we have ground observations of the sun. We can measure solar luminosity in these very accurate ways. And the solar hasn't the sun's energy output just hasn't changed that much over the past 50 years, so it can't be the sun. And what you've done is that now you've spent a couple minutes talking about the sun, right? So a better way to respond to that is to not immediately leap into that, but to say, scientists have looked at all the things that could be causing climate change, and it turns out it's these heat-trapping emissions from burning gas and burning coal and destroying tropical forests. And we know that because there's all this extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide has a signature. Scientifically, we can tell it's from burning coal and oil. It's from destroying tropical forests. It's not natural. And scientists have looked at all those other possible causes too. They've looked at volcanoes and the sun and the Earth's orbital tilt and all this other stuff. And it turns out that the number one thing, the biggest thing, has been burning these fossil fuels, has been these heat-trapping emissions that industrial activities are putting into the atmosphere and all this carbon dioxide. So that's the kind of the detective story of climate change, and that's how we know that it's caused by fossil fuels. And then forget mentioning the sun, right? So hopefully it's clear how that's more broadly applicable. This is also this is a rally that I helped out with outside of the American Geophysical Union. Scientists don't often rally. They don't often stand up and do big public events like this where they put all the lab coats on. And I love this guy's sign. ICE has no agenda. It just melts. The scientists are really worried about the prevalence of misinformation and conspiracy theories about their research. As I said earlier, scientists are more engaged than I've ever seen them. And especially for climate researchers, they've dealt with misinformation about their field for 20 plus years now, but maybe even longer. I've been working in this field for about a decade and have been dealing with really bad misinformation about climate science since day one. And a lot of these myths about climate change, they've been debunked repeatedly. And this is true across a lot of the issues that you might work on too. These myths about voter fraud have been debunked hundreds of times, thousands of times, and they don't go away, right? Why do these zombie myths persist? Why do these conspiracy theories persist? They persist because people who want really bad policy outcomes keep flacking these myths. So in my field, there's some evidence that if you tell people about the origin of misinformation about climate change, that it comes from these big national lobbying groups for the fossil fuel industry, that helps them understand why the myths exist, why the misinformation is out there. And instead of getting into the weeds on the science or having to put a lanyard on and go to a conference, it's a simpler explanation. It's very often a very accurate explanation for where the misinformation is coming from. But more important, I think we need to move, especially in these issues where the misinformation is just dogging you from day one. We need to talk about the consequences of the misinformation. Misinformation about climate science isn't just bad because it's untrue or because it's false or because it disrespects the role that science should play in policymaking. It's bad because it hurts people. This is a picture I took. This is 30 minutes north of where I grew up. This is the roller coaster at Seaside Heights, New Jersey, in the ocean after Hurricane Sandy, a storm that was made worse by climate change because of sea level rise, because storms carried more precipitation when they hit the coast. And as I looked at my home region rebuild, we got to use climate science, right? We can't rebuild for the climate of the past. We don't have that climate anymore. We've got to rebuild for the climate of the future. So when we look at the consequences of misinformation about climate change, it hurts people. It hurts coastal communities. It makes our air quality worse. And I think we need to concentrate on that part of the misinformation battle, right? Because misinformation does hurt people if you base policy on it. Policy needs to be based on real information, not this misinformation. We can so easily get caught playing whack-a-mole with misinformation. It's really easy to fall into that trap of repeating the myths. And it's actually easy to fall into the trap of letting the myths and the misinformation become a main focus of our own communication. This is a paper, one of the folks who worked on that debunking handbook, Stefan Lewandowski, was the lead author, and he calls this seepage. And in climate change, this is the idea that climate scientists are producing papers in the scientific literature in their community to debunk climate denial talking points that are coming from outside their community, that are coming from bloggers, that are coming from industry groups that don't want to address climate change, that are coming from ideologues. And they feel the need to address these issues, and they wind up addressing them in the scientific literature. And when they do that, they accidentally elevate that myth from outside their community into their community. Now it's like, whoa, scientists are debating this myth in the scientific literature. It must be really important. And that's the impression that they accidentally give to the outside world. And I find we do this a lot because for anybody who works in these fields who, we who don the lanyards and care about the complexity and the nuance and all that, we really don't like misinformation. We really don't like when people spread nasty conspiracy theories about the people we work with, right? And it can wind up dominating our thinking, and it can wind up putting us in this unfortunate space where we're letting the trolls, the haters, the folks who are trying to tear us down affect too much of our thinking and too much of our public communication, when in fact, a lot of people in the outside world, they don't know what your detractors have to say. They're not paying attention to that every day. They're listening to your message if you're putting something out there. So we really need to spend, I think 80, 90, maybe 99% of our time proactively communicating our messages in this modern communications environment, not getting bogged down in defeating the misinformation. And I will say for the record that I have quoted Taylor Swift lyrics at a scientific conference to make this exact point. And this is what I always point back to is the haters are going to hate, and sometimes you just got to shake it off. And it sounds a little silly, but in practice, when I talk to my peers in communications who work in the entertainment industry, who work on behalf of artists and musicians, they spend none of their time on their detractors, right? It's a very different communications environment. And we don't always have that luxury, right, when we're talking about public policy. But I do think as in a general sense, we spend a little bit too much time stepping into an opposition frame when we should be in that proactive frame and pushing that. One other thing that I'll flag, and we will definitely have some time for some questions here. I'll try to whip through this. This is a great book by Randy Olson. Randy is a really unique communicator. He is a scientist turned filmmaker. And this is a synthesis of a lot of work he's been doing. I've always been a big fan of his work. But the core thing here is he talks about the importance of having a narrative into which your communication fits. And I think this is also true for debunking misinformation. And I'll show you an example from a scientific field in which I've worked. But I want to really emphasize this template that he's developed. And there's a lot of messaging templates out there. Some have 3 parts or 4 parts or 5 parts. There's a ton in science communication. I see a lot in policy communication. Everybody's got their method. And I think because Randy has this experience of being very science-minded, but also working in filmmaking, he's found something that's deeper and that undergirds a lot of the communications that we try to do. And he calls it the and, but, therefore template, or ADT. And South Park helped him discover this. He was watching a behind-the-scenes thing about South Park, and one of the creators said, to enhance dramatic tension, what we do is anytime we look at our script and we see the word and, we replace it with a but. And Randy thought, that's interesting. That's true. It is dramatic. But is a word of contradiction. How do you resolve contradiction? And he was looking at a lot of his communication. He was looking at scientific abstracts, right? And he was looking at press releases. He was looking at op-eds, stuff that did well. And he found these and, but, therefore templates in a lot of this communication. And I think it can be really helpful to think at the simplest level, what is the and, but, therefore story you're trying to tell about your issue? So he did one on sea level rise. This one's not my picture. I don't have an airplane or a drone. So this was a project that he did with a bunch of sea level rise researchers to help unify their presentations and build themes into the communications work they were doing. This was the template that undergirded all the specific communication they did. For 8,000 years, sea level has been stable and civilizations have been built right to the edge of the ocean. But for the past 150 years, sea level has been rising rapidly. Therefore, it is time to come up with a new management plan for coastal areas, which is pretty straightforward, right? But for scientists, they might spend a lot of time on the and. They want to talk about every single thing we know. They might want to spend a lot of time talking about the but, and in this, therefore, you really need this complete picture for people to help make sense of why the facts matter. This is Jenny McCarthy. If any of you have followed vaccine controversies over the years, she's spread a lot of misinformation about vaccines causing autism. All that has been retracted. It's been debunked. There's still some pockets of folks who opt their kids out of the vaccine system, which has been a bummer because some diseases that we had almost completely beat have popped back up in these communities. Thankfully, almost everybody does follow the vaccine regimen. They protect the kids, they protect the community. She had a very simple but inaccurate story that she told in these high-profile media interviews. And that story was vaccines are widely administered and no one questions them. But when my child received vaccines, he became autistic. Therefore, we need to be suspicious of vaccines, right? And actually, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has criticized vaccines over the years, he actually just met with Trump on this recently. This is unfortunately has popped back up again in a very high-profile way. But Paul Offit is an epidemiologist who has done so much work over the years debunking this misinformation and helping people understand why vaccines are important. And he's given a lot of great interviews. He's a very seasoned communicator. He's one of those scientists who's just been in the arena for years, and he has really good stories about why this matters. So he has 2 and but therefore messages that he goes out with. And as I want to show you these. So the first one is kind of the general way he talks about this, which is to say that he sympathizes with parents who worry about this, but thankfully they're scientific questions with scientific answers. Therefore, we can trust the science. Right, and this is kind of a general message, and he backs that up with an even more specific story that also follows this very clear and but therefore format. And it's a longer story, but he says, my wife, who's also a clinician, was getting ready to give a child a vaccine. And as she was pulling the vaccine into the syringe, the child had a seizure. But if that child's seizure had come after the shot, it would have been very difficult to convince the parents they weren't connected. Therefore, we can't trust anecdotes. We have to trust the scientific method. Can't trust anecdotes. We have to trust the scientific method. Now, is this a more complicated story than the misinformation-based one? Sure. It also has the advantage of being accurate. And because he's somebody who's told this story a lot, it's become a very effective explanatory vehicle. And I actually shared this with a bunch of public health researchers once, and one of them said, oh gosh, I've heard Paul tell that story so many times, I'm sick of it. And I said, that's great, because there's an old adage in advertising and marketing that by the time you are so sick of your main message, that's the point when it might be getting through to external audiences, right? So this is something that he's honed. I think if you're working on a policy campaign, you can find the messages that are even simpler than this, but are also accurate. And I wanted to highlight this. The sea level rise one is more proactive communication. This is also how you can use this format to really think critically about how you debunk misinformation. I think it's very powerful. This is my guess at what the ABTs were for the 3 major presidential candidates this year. I think Bernie Sanders' ABT was this: the elites on Wall Street are doing better than ever, but the vast majority of people in the United States are losing ground and they are hurting. Therefore, we need a political revolution to fix the system. You'll know this one. Things used to be nice and simple, but now the elites are putting immigrants and political correctness ahead of you, the silent majority of hardworking Americans. So trust me to make America great again. I think Clinton's campaign narrative, a lot of people have criticized Clinton campaign. You know, what was their narrative? I actually think they had a narrative, and it was that America works best when we work together, but that Trump is trying to divide us. So we need to show that we are stronger together, and then I'm with her, right? But I think all of these stories told people where they fit in to that narrative, and into that narrative about what's wrong with the country, what's causing people pain, what's causing problems, and then what you can do now that you've been exposed to this story to solve it, right? And I think for a lot of the issues that we work on, I think people are ready to really step up and do big things to solve big problems. And I'll leave you with one story that I was so struck by in Rules for Revolutionaries, which two of the Sanders folks wrote after the primaries, but before the election. And I want to tell a quick story. He was working at Credo Mobile. A lot of you probably get Credo's emails or Credo's customers. And he was part of this big protest outside the White House against the Keystone XL pipeline. This was a protest that went on for days. People were getting arrested outside the White House. And he was also getting arrested as one of the organizers. He was also participating. So he sits down, refuses to move. That's what was triggering people getting arrested. And there's a guy sitting next to him. He's going to get arrested too. And he strikes up a conversation with him and says, so how'd you get here? And the guy says, well, I just got an email that said to, come down and get arrested to protest this pipeline. And, it seemed like the right thing to do. And of course, this guy works at Credo. So he was like, hey, do you remember whose email it was? And the guy's, yeah, I don't know. I'm on a lot of lists. And so he got the guy's name. And he looks up the guy's name later after they got processed. And this guy who drove down from Pennsylvania to get arrested in DC had been on Credo's list for years. He had never clicked on a petition. He had never clicked on a send a message to your member of Congress. He had never clicked on a donate button. But the second someone asked him to do something big to solve a big problem, he was there. So I think the lesson that the Sanders folks had was to think about our audiences in a way that they frame it, they call it big organizing as opposed to small organizing. So getting away from this idea that we have a big list and we're going to walk people up the ladder of engagement. And, I had a great day at work if I got a 6% response rate to my petition instead of a 5% response rate. Instead, they said, look at what the most committed 1% of your audience can do. And they might actually be ready to do really big, incredible things. And as disappointing as the election results were for me, as much as the scientists who work in public agencies are worried and hurting right now, I look at what's happened since the election, and there has just been this incredible outpouring of interest and engagement. And for all of us who've worked in this field for years, I think we have an incredible opportunity to help other people who want to get involved for the first time learn what to do, figure out what to do effectively, and maybe do really, really big things. Because I think we're in a spot where that's necessary, and we're in a spot where we can actually make it happen. So as I refuse to let the despondency get me down. I really think we do have an opportunity to do a lot of great proactive stuff in the next couple of years and keep our energy up and be so welcoming to all the new people who are coming into these issues.
Well, Aaron, that is great. Can you hear me?
I think, yeah, I can. And I put up a summary slide here if folks want to,
all right,
screen grab that or whatever. Yeah.
Sure, grab. Yeah, no, I apologize for some reason. It said on my end that I wasn't muted, but you and Bernie couldn't hear me. I think that particularly this last segment, but the entire context, it leaves people with tangible, concrete tools and how to strategize and effectively impact progressive policy change in the respective community. I think it's like the last segment, but therefore and if you could go back to the narratives of the presidential races, there were a few people who asked about those, and so I wanted to make sure that we can put it back up on the screen. That'd be great. We also have a question here, which I will bring forth. Start with Carolyn. Carolyn, are you there with us? Hello,
hey.
Carolyn?
Carolyn, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi, how are you? Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
I wanted to go back to the first thing you said at the beginning of this section about, do you believe in science? And I'm always struck, pollsters will ask people, do you believe in climate change? Or do you believe in God? It sort of sounds like.
Totally.
And the way it's talked about, if you're a scientist and say you have a drug that you think is going to cure cancer, You can't just say, well, this drug cures cancer because I believe it. Cure cancer, you know, you have to do the experiments, and it might not cure cancer at the end. And I don't know if that's real. I don't hear that really being communicated with respect to science.
Yeah. I think one of the things that happens when we say believe, and President Obama did this a lot too. You know, we believe that climate change is real. Especially when I hear that from a politician, it takes that issue and that science and it puts it in a political identity box for people. And you know, I've had conversations with relatives about climate change, and they know I work with climate scientists for a living. And you know, it, there's some people you just can't even have the conversation with, right? Because their identity is so wrapped up in rejecting climate change or, you know, hating Al Gore or whatever they've been told by their sources of information that they won't let that go. And that's because they see it as a matter of political belief and as a matter of political identity. You know, for anybody who's that hardened, you almost really can't talk to them about the science because the misinformation has just been, you know, adopted so vehemently. You have to approach it from another angle entirely if you're going to have a productive conversation. But yeah, anytime I see believe, I think, okay, well, now we're talking about values in politics, and even you know, with these other fields of science, like you mentioned the cancer example, none of us have to have a conversation about, you know, believing that cancer is bad. It's just obvious. But yeah, that's the underpinning there. That's why we support research into fighting cancer. And that's a conversation that's a lot less politicized. We still make political decisions about public funding for that research, but you know, we've all had personal experiences with it. We all want to solve cancer, just like we all want to avoid asteroid strikes. So it's interesting to look at those areas where the science isn't perceived as controversial, and it's very straightforward. The science just informs the policy making, and things are good. So getting more science in that area is important. And you know, my hope over time is that more of us can learn to respect that role that science has in policymaking. But I also know that, you know, realistically, that's just not going to happen on every issue, and perceptions of science are going to get wrapped into those issues of political identity, just you know, depending on what the issue of the day is and how they hit people's different political biases.
Great. I think we got Hank here again. Hank, are you there? Are you live? Hello, Hank?
Are you on mute, Hank?
It seems the science has failed me, Aaron. Anyway, it was Hank. I mean, there was some other, this other question that came up in the course, of this conversation, and we've done a lot of sessions. Our Voice and Our Values manual at Public Leadership Institute, which those joining can access at our website at publicleadershipinstitute.org. We talk about coming to a lot of these conversations from a values frame, and so there were actually a few people who lifted up a few ways, like how advantageous is it to set up our arguments, especially if we're going after a persuadable audience, but using a values frame that then is infused with scientific fact and the credibility associated with scientists and other things. And so it's kind of like juxtaposing a values frame with scientific evidence. How do you reconcile those? I mean, does a values frame allow us to come into a place where we can present information in a way that roots back into kind of that visceral reaction? We talked about, you talked about just, recently that, the confirmational bias that that an individual might have, just refusing to accept climate change, and you're not going to be able to move. You're not going to move that person. They have already convinced themselves, and there's no bit of information that's going to move them from what they believe, almost in ideologically, but to a deity level, right? So, is there? How would you react to this? The idea of coming to a lot of these conversations from kind of foundational values based, and then bringing the information in. You talked about it earlier about myth and fact and how we appropriately debunk some of that. I don't have the best question. How do we reconcile those pieces, or what do you recommend is the best way to further the conversation that leads to persuasion?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple different ways of answering that. So I'd say that in the first order, whenever we're having a values-based conversation, particularly about policy, we want to be really clear about our values first, and then science is like science is like the side course of the dessert, right? It's the facts and the evidence that's informing that values-based conversation. Very often we treat science as the appetizer. It's this thing that I'm going to talk about first. Now I'm going to talk about policy, and it makes it sound like the science is justifying a particular policy outcome. But lead with those values first. Think about them. Then back up your views with the science. Rely on the scientists to make sure that you have accurate information to inform the debate. The other way to think about values is to think about it in terms of ideology and being really clear about some of the ideological triggers that we hit around a lot of these issues. And particularly on environmental protection, there's a concept of cultural cognition, and there's a guy named Dan Kahan at Yale University who's done a lot on this, DANKAHAN. And the cultural cognition school of thought points out that people have individualistic versus communitarian values. Am I going to do what's best for the community, or am I going to do what's best for individuals personally? And they also have values that are hierarchical versus egalitarian. It's a little nerdy, but basically, big business, military, police, et cetera, power structure, kind of hierarchies. Versus egalitarian, more grassroots movement, fairer distribution of wealth, kind of attitudes towards public life. So you can imagine for environmental protection, if you're a hierarchical individualist, the idea that cars should get more fuel efficient over time, your first thought is, well, that could affect what kind of car I'm going to buy, and that's unfair to the auto companies. I don't like it. And if you're a communitarian egalitarian, you're like, yes, all of our cars should become more fuel efficient, and the air should be cleaner, and everybody's all in this together, and we need to protect the community. And political debates can cross over those ideological lines in a lot of weird ways. And I think just being aware of them is really important. For folks who are really into politics, they've kind of sorted themselves out into those camps. But the good news is we have all these other universal values that exist outside of ideological politics and are more like local politics, right? Is the river in our community clean or not? Is our shoreline protected from a big storm or not? And it's to go back to the first section there, if I go out to get sushi dinner with my spouse, do I know that it's going to be clean and safe to eat? If I'm going to eat some raw fish as a treat, right? If I want a little delicacy. So that sort of very practical, grounded stuff we can all agree on that's really important, all these things that science does to help make all of that possible. That's where I see the most successful communication campaigns because they wind up avoiding a lot of those very difficult ideological conversations and traps. They wind up avoiding a lot of those sort of endless disputes you can get into of real science versus something somebody read in a blog once.
Great. Well, Aaron, everybody, I think everyone would agree with me that Aaron Hurtis has done an incredible job of providing us a framework how to talk about these things. You can see his contact information on the screen right now. And we're kind of at the end of our allotted time, but I encourage you to reach out to Aaron if you have any further questions around this. Aaron, on behalf of the Public Leadership Institute, I want to say thank you for your time. This has been incredible. This has been incredibly informative for me personally, and I believe that all the people around the country that are joining us this afternoon. This is stuff that we can take and and get some direct utility out of in our respective works. So I want to again thank you for your time and all of your insights around this, which arguably can be a very complex topic to engage in, and left us with a means to talk about it in a way that's simple, that frankly every one of us will be able to use right immediately.
Awesome, thank you, and everybody, keep up your hard work, and yeah, please do tweet at me, email me. Love to hear more about what you're up to and the communication challenges that you're facing, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks.
Great. Thanks again, Aaron. And for everyone who's joining us, please look forward to joining us every other week. Generally Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern time. You'll get the emails. Stay in touch, and we look forward to seeing you at a future policy leadership webinar around important topics to help support and more effectively do our work. Take care, everyone. Have a good one.